Hi everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Kathryn Francis to speak with us today. Dr. Francis is a lecturer in psychology at Keele University, and prior to this position, she was a lecturer in the Division of Psychology at the University of Bradford and a postdoctoral research fellow across the Department of Philosophy and School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences at the University of Reading. Dr. Francis has particular interest in moral psychology and social cognition research, having published several papers looking at judgment behavior discrepancy. So, for example, saying one thing and doing another in moral contexts. In addition to moral inconsistency, her research also focuses on the intersection of morality and medicine, as well as morality and food choices. We're very excited to have her here today, so please join me in welcoming her as she presents Using Virtual Reality in Moral Psychology, Virtual Trolley Problems and Simulated Actions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melton, for a really, really nice introduction. So I'm just going to share my slides, and if you could let me know as soon as they're working, that would be great. Can you see? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so before I get started, I just want to say a huge thank you to Melton and Jim for bringing together such an amazing network of people with similar interests from all over the world. I think it's great. And thank you for letting me be part of this sort of seminar series. So a lot of the work that I do uses virtual reality technologies in moral psychology. And today I'm really focusing on the work that I've done using virtual trolley problems. And as I've got about 40 minutes, I wanted to kind of give you an overview of this research. So the way that we're going to run through this is to start talking about typical moral dilemmas in the field. And I think most of you will be familiar with these, but we'll talk through them anyway so that we can think a little bit about the methodology itself. I'll then go on to talk about kind of this judgment behavior discrepancy, the relationship between action and judgment, which is something that I'm really interested in. And that this sort of leads into the work that I've been doing using VR. And I'll end with some sort of new work looking at kind of mode of presentation and how that affects decision making. Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the trolley problem, and for many years now, moral psychologists and philosophers have relied on these kind of text-based vignettes to study moral judgments and moral decision-making. And the classic example that we often refer to is the trolley problem, which comprises these two cases, the footbridge case and the switch case. And as I said, many of you will be familiar with these, but I want to walk us through them so we can consider the methodology or the use of these more closely. So let's look at the switch dilemma first. So in the switch type case, you have this runaway trolley train car heading down the track towards these 5 construction workers, and they don't hear it approaching, and you have no way of warning them that it's hurtling towards them. And if it continues on its present course, it's going to hit and it's going to kill those 5 individuals. You're actually standing next to a point or a switch that operates some points in the track. And if you choose to flick that switch, the runaway train car is going to be diverted down one track instead, where there's a single worker. And so typically we would present a switch type case like this, and then we might ask participants, is it morally acceptable for you to flick the switch in this case? And typically what you find with these switch type cases is a high percentage of people saying, yes, it's morally acceptable to do this. And that's become known as this kind of characteristically utilitarian response. I'm sure we could talk about whether that's a utilitarian response for a much longer than today, but we'll call it a characteristically utilitarian response. So approving of the action of sacrificing one life in order to save many more. And then on the other sort of half of this trolley problem, you've got the footbridge dilemma. So similar events are playing out. So you've got the runaway train car, runaway trolley again heading down the track towards those 5 construction workers. Again, they can't hear it approaching. You have no way of warning them. But you're in a slightly different situation this time. So you're standing on a footbridge above the situation. And in front of you is standing this really large person. And if you choose to push that large person off the footbridge, their large bulk is going to fall on the track below, where the train car will collide with that person and it'll derail. And that individual will be killed, but you'll be saving those 5 workers. or those 5 people on the track. And again, if we ask people, is this morally acceptable to push the person? What we typically get with the footbridge type cases is a different pattern of responses. So now we get far fewer people giving these characteristically utilitarian responses. Most people say, no, it's not morally acceptable. No, I wouldn't do this. And there's been a number of different models and approaches and ways of trying to understand why we're getting differences, why we see these different responses, given their structural similarity in entailing that 1 to 5 trade-off. And perhaps one of the earliest models in the field, or one that gets referred to a lot, is Green's dual process model. And I want to talk you through this because I'm going to come back to this later on. So according to this model, what's driving these differences are essentially differences in underlying mechanisms. So when we read a moral dilemma like the footbridge case, we get this immediate aversive emotional response at the thought of that action, at the thought of what's required of us in that situation. And it's thought that that kind of immediate aversive response drives non-utilitarian decisions. So that's why most people say, no, it's not morally acceptable. Whereas in these switch type cases, these more impersonal cases, you don't get that immediate aversive emotional reaction at the thought of the action described. And so it's thought that these more reasoned cognitive controlled systems can drive the decision making. And that's why you get a much higher percentage of these characteristically utilitarian responses. And as I said before, there are other adaptations to this model, but there are also alternative models, but I'm going to come back to this one later on in the talk. So really early on, when I was studying moral psychology during my PhD, I became interested not necessarily in unpicking why people respond differently to these 2 types of cases, but in the methodology itself. So if you think about a moral psychology experiment in this area, generally what happens, the participant comes into the lab, or they complete your study online, and they're presented with this text-based vignette. So they don't even see the diagrams that I just presented to you. And then typically we ask them a series of questions. And so we might ask them a judgment question. Is it morally acceptable? Is it appropriate? And then sort of a while ago, researchers also introduced this action choice question. So would you do it? And there's some early evidence that there were differences in how people responded to these 2 questions. And that was seen as initial evidence or early evidence of some kind of judgment behavior discrepancy. And this is really where I became interested, because to me, the question, would you do it, was still quite hypothetical in nature and didn't necessarily feel like an action choice to me, or a behavioral measure. And we know from other areas of research that saying isn't the same as doing, and that people actually display quite large amounts of moral inconsistency in specific contexts. But when it comes to this field of research, so if we think about morality of harm, we face a number of challenges if we want to study moral actions. And I could list these for a long time, but I'm just going to pick 2. So the first challenge is a methodological one. So if we think about these trolley type cases, these sacrificial dilemmas specifically, generally they are almost like impossible world scenarios because they're very far-fetched and implausible. So we don't really see instances of these things happening in the real world. Or at least you're not going to leave your house right now, go and grab a coffee and bump into some kind of situation like the switch dilemma playing out in front of you. The second challenge we face, which is a bigger challenge, is an ethical one. So it would be completely inappropriate for us to expose participants to these kinds of life and death situations. And this is where virtual reality technologies really slotted into my research. So using VR and associated technologies allowed us to simulate sensations, experiences, these kind of scenarios that would feel realistic and look relatively realistic, but without compromising the welfare of our participants. And actually, if you look at reviews of sort of the incorporation of VR as a methodology in across the social sciences and the natural sciences, it does seem to offer a good balance between experimental control and aspects of experimental realism. So that feeds nicely into sort of the next section of my talk. So this is the virtual morality section. So how can we use virtual reality then to study moral decision making? And I'm going to take you back to some of the really early studies that we did in this area. So one of the first questions that I wanted to ask was simply whether moral actions simulated in virtual reality moral dilemmas would be different from the moral judgments given in response to these original text-based vignettes. And in the really early studies that we did, we created a virtual version of the footbridge dilemma. So you can see that in the top of the screen here. And this is actually a screenshot from one of the early moral dilemmas. Since then, we've created others. You can see just a few examples at the bottom. But these studies that I'm talking to you about now really focus on the footbridge dilemma specifically. And just to sort of pick out a few sort of key differences between virtual moral dilemmas and text-based moral dilemmas. So virtual reality moral dilemmas have both auditory and visual salients, which text-based dilemmas don't have. So you can really map out a sort of soundscape within that environment, and you can manipulate that in many different ways. But crucially, the events in that scene, they play out in real time as if they would in real life, or at least that's how we set them up in the original studies. And of course, that gives you the ability to change that timeline as well. And I think most crucially, it gives you the opportunity to observe and measure actions in the moment of decision making. Okay, so in this first study, comparing moral actions in VR and moral judgments with the text-based vignettes, we had two groups of individuals. So let's look at the individuals who complete the experiment in kind of the traditional format first. So one group of participants read the text-based version of the footbridge dilemma, and then we asked them the judgment question and the action choice question. Is it morally acceptable, and would you do it? And in this case, they respond on a binary scale, yes and no. So let's look at their responses first. So along the y-axis here, you've got percentage of responses, and along the x-axis, you've got our two groups, action and judgment, and we're looking at the judgment group first. So the dark bars are the characteristically utilitarian responses, so that's people who have said yes in response to these questions, and the pale grey bars are the characteristically non-utilitarian responses, so they say no. So you can see that this is the typical pattern we'd expect with these personal, up-close moral dilemmas like the footbridge. 80% or higher say, no, it's not morally acceptable to push this person. No, I wouldn't do it. Now, we had a second group of participants who were immersed in the virtual reality version of the footbridge dilemma instead, and they were presented with that using the Oculus Rift. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this technology, it's essentially like wearing a pair of goggles, and that will sort of transport you into a virtual world. So you can look all around you and you're kind of immersed in that moral dilemma. And as the events played out in real time, participants then had the opportunity to act. So they could either push a joystick forward to push the person off the footbridge or refuse. So just omit a response. And if we look at the data from that group, we can see a big difference in how individuals responded. So when immersed in this virtual reality footbridge dilemma, we then got around 70% of participants endorsing the utilitarian outcome, which means they pushed the virtual avatar in VR. So when I first ran this back in 2016, I was really surprised by these results for a number of reasons, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the first thing we did was replicate this. So this is the data from a student sample, but we've now replicated this in the general public. So you see the same flip pattern of responses. And we also ran some studies with specialist populations. So you still get this same flip pattern of responses in paramedics training at a university, and also experienced incident commanders working for the fire service in the UK. So you can see the same flip pattern of responses. Okay, so at this point, we'd found some evidence that individuals were responding differently in virtual reality compared to text, but it still didn't really satisfy some of the questions and some of the concerns I already had about methodologies being used in the area. And that was because there was no incorporation of haptic feedback and realistic touch. And we know from research in social and moral psychology that concepts like physical contact and personal force are important to consider, and they can actually influence and affect decision making. So at this stage, I needed to find a way, or I wanted to find a way to incorporate these into the paradigms that we were using. So I'm just going to show you two ways in which we did this, and I'll present them together and then show you the results from both of these studies. So let's look at the incorporation of haptic feedback first. So this is the feeling sort of multisensory feedback. So in order to run this study, I worked with the Center for Robotics and Neural Systems at Plymouth University, and we incorporated this haptic virtual reality device known as the VBot. And you can see the VBot in these pictures here. It's essentially a large robotic setup, but it has a robotic arm. And that robotic arm can simulate physical resistance force, and it can make actions feel more realistic. So just to give you a couple of examples of what that might feel like, you can generate the sensation of moving your arm through smooth water versus choppy water. You can generate the sensation of you sort of rubbing your hand along a brick wall versus smooth concrete. So it can produce sort of these really fine sensations via haptic feedback. So what we did was we had participants this time respond to a number of moral dilemmas, and they would then have to respond using this robotic arm. So if a participant was responding to the footbridge dilemma, for example, and they wanted to push the person off the footbridge, they would push this robotic arm forward, and it would generate physical resistance force as if they'd actually performed that action. So it would feel as though you'd come into contact with this large person's body, and if you pushed hard enough, it would spring away from you. And so in this case, we incorporated 15 different footbridge type dilemmas, so these personal moral dilemmas. Okay, but using the VBot was really good in terms of haptic feedback, but it's still missing that physical contact and that sense of touch. So there's no consideration of sort of corporeal sensations. And so in order to incorporate that into the picture, I worked closely with a speculative designer, Aggie Haynes, and a cognitive psychologist, Raluca Briazu. And together, we designed an experiment that would incorporate an interactive sculpture. So Aggie designed this sculpture of a large person's back, and this was designed to be combined with virtual reality. So you would respond with this instead of a joystick. And I'm just going to walk you through some of the features of this setup. So the torso itself was created using expandable foam and platinum grade silicon, but I don't know if anyone's ever touched platinum grade silicon. It feels very realistic, but it's very cold to touch. So Aggie built a layer of heated wiring beneath that, and that would generate a very lifelike body temperature. So combined together, it would create a very realistic sense of touch. And that torso was weighted. So if in virtual reality, an individual chose to push forward to push the person off the footbridge, that torso would fall past a set of springs and along a runner, and that would generate the sensation of a really heavy body free falling. And as I said before, that was synced to what was happening in virtual reality. So if you push the sculpture and it fell, that virtual avatar would then be pushed off the footbridge in VR. And I should say here as well that this sculpture was weighted to the weight or anticipated weight of someone that size. So in many cases, you would have to push with both hands in order to generate enough personal force for that to actually move. Okay, so let me show you the results of both of these studies that incorporate haptics and touch. So let's look at the results from the VBot study first. So again, we've got the same setup as I showed you before. We have one group that responds in the traditional format and one group that responds with these kind of VR and haptic formats incorporated. So in this study, we're looking at the average percentage of responses across 15 personal moral dilemmas. So you can see again, the patterns are what we would expect. So the majority of the responses are non-utilitarian or characteristically non-utilitarian. So they're saying, no, it's not morally acceptable. No, I wouldn't do it. But you get a significantly different response pattern when you look at the simulated action group who are responding using the virtual reality haptic device. So again, the majority of responses are now utilitarian as compared to non-utilitarian. But again, what happens when you incorporate this much more physical sense of touch, these corporeal sensations? So now again, we're looking at responses just to the footbridge dilemma. So this is individuals responding in the traditional format to the text-based dilemma. Again, 90% of individuals are saying, no, it's not morally acceptable to push the person. No, I wouldn't do it. But when you incorporate the virtual reality scenario with the interactive sculpture as the response device, you still see this significant difference in pattern of responses. So you're still seeing significantly more individuals endorsing the utilitarian outcome in the virtual reality scenario. Okay, so that's just a taste of some of the work in virtual reality. And I'm really interested in hearing your feedback and your thoughts on these. So let's now go back to theory and think about some of the consequences. So if you look at all of the studies that we've ran so far using virtual and haptic devices or technologies and comparing them against sort of this traditional format, and you just take judgments made in the traditional format and you average them, you get an average of 20% utilitarian judgments across all of the studies. And that actually fits nicely with, existing predictions from these dual process approaches where, these are personal moral dilemmas. They provoke these strong emotional reactions. And that's why most people are saying no. And very few people are saying yes. So we can use those models to explain what's happening in those kind of text-based vignettes in these more traditional formats. But it's much harder to explain what's happening when virtual actions are required in the different types of virtual and haptic setups we've used. So if you take all of the studies that we've done and you average the number of characteristically utilitarian responses across those, you get 65%. Now, according to Green's dual process model, we'd probably predict even fewer characteristically utilitarian responses in virtual reality, because when any scenario is put in virtual reality, it tends to trigger stronger emotional or stronger arousal generally anyway. So combined together, we would expect even fewer, but that's not the case here. And so some of the work that we've been working on or we've been looking at the moment is unpicking why we get these different response patterns. So I'm just going to present two ideas to you and then a few more studies that we've been running on this. So one of the ideas is that what's driving differences is that virtual reality, the actual mode itself, changes what drives decision making. And these are, or this is an idea adapted from Cushman's action outcome value model. So if you think about yourself reading a text-based moral dilemma, you've got to make that 1 to 5 comparison in your head. So you've got to make that trade-off in using your imagination. But when you're in a virtual reality moral dilemma, that comparison is very easy because it's visually right in front of you. And so it might be that the thought of seeing those 5 individuals be hit by this train car and die, that the negative value you associate with that could then outweigh any negativity you felt about pushing that one individual in the first place. So that's one possible way of us interpreting this and thinking about this. But another approach that I think really adds value here is if we look at perspective theories. So again, if you imagine yourself reading a moral dilemma presented to you in text format, generally you're using allocentric evaluations to guide your decision making. So you're thinking about what's required of you in a particular situation. So you might be acting in the interests of others, and I think social norms may play a role to some extent there. Whereas when you're immersed in virtual reality, you're acting in the interest of yourself. So you're thinking about the consequences of your own actions in that particular situation. And this is something that we're trying to look at more closely now in a set of experiments. But I'd be really interested in hearing what you have to say about this and some of your feedback on both of these ideas and these theories. Okay, so in terms of next steps. So one of the things that I've been trying to do over the last couple of years now, is thinking about mode of presentation. So rather than assuming that what we see here is a judgment behavior discrepancy, which is really difficult to talk about when you're using virtual trolley problems, is to also consider whether mode of presentation is what's changing how people respond to these cases. And so in order to look at this, I've been running a series of studies where we add small amounts of contextual information in different ways across a series of studies to see if that's affecting decision making. So we move slowly from text to virtual reality. And I'm just going to present the results of a few of those studies now, and we're currently still running these studies at the moment. So in the first of these studies, all I wanted to do was compare how participants respond to text-based vignettes and vignettes that are presented with images. And we call those low visual, so with a few images, high visual with many images, just to see if this does affect decision making. So we had participants in these three groups: text only, low visual, high visual, and they responded to these two questions, the judgment question and the action choice question. And I will present the data now. So along the y-axis here, you're seeing utilitarian responses again. And this time we make a distinction between the personal and the impersonal. So the footbridge type cases and the switch type cases. Now, the key thing to take away from this graph is that you see there's no real difference in responses across those three modes of presentation. And it's the same for the action choice question. So we're seeing, well, we find no evidence of main effect of mode of presentation here on moral decision making. So using text versus images doesn't really seem to be making a difference here. And then we take this one step further. So now we think about what else is in these virtual environments, and that's sound, and we begin to think about movement as well. So in this next study, we compared text to visuals and sound to visual sounds and sequences. So just to give you an idea of what these moving sequences look like, in this particular case, there are enemy soldiers approaching. So the moving sequence would look something like this. So you see the threat approaching you. And again, we compare how individuals respond to these. So in the version of this experiment I'm presenting now, we also incorporate a more action relevant response rather than responding to these two questions. So if you're going to do it now, and they respond with a joystick. And you can see percentage of responses on the y-axis again, and you're looking at personal and impersonal dilemmas. But again, you can see that the main thing to look at here is that there doesn't seem to be a difference in responses across these three modes of presentation. So even when we incorporate sounds and images, and when we incorporate sounds, images, and these moving sequences. So again, we find no evidence that this kind of difference in mode of presentation is affecting moral decision making. And then more recently, we've taken that a step further and started to incorporate 2D video with sounds. So we compare text to these, and this is actually a video recorded from within virtual reality. So you get that kind of first-hand experience. And this kind of gives you a feel for what those VR dilemmas might be like as well. And again, we compare the response to text and 2D video, and this is relatively new data. Again, across those two questions, is it morally acceptable? Would you do it? And this time, because they're just responding to the footbridge dilemma again, you see percentage of responses along the y-axis. Dark bars are the characteristically utilitarian responses. And again, the key thing to take away here is that there doesn't seem to be differences as you move between those two modes of presentation. So we're not seeing differences between text and 2D video here. So again, we're not finding evidence at the moment in these studies that these modes, these manipulations of mode of presentation are affecting moral decision making. But one thing to say immediately is obviously virtual reality is immersive. So we need to consider things like presence and interaction and how they're playing a role in this as well. And this is something that I'm working on at the moment. The other thing to raise here is then this question about are we measuring different underlying constructs? So are we actually capturing a judgment action discrepancy? And if so, where do we take this next? So there is evidence of this judgment behavior discrepancy now beyond these virtual reality trolley type problems. So we found this judgment behavior discrepancy consistently in a series of virtual and haptic based moral dilemmas using personal moral dilemmas like the footbridge. But Indrajit Patil has found the same in the switch type cases, and Melissa McDonald, based in the US, has found that same judgment behavior discrepancy in both personal and impersonal moral dilemmas. So there's a good evidence using this particular methodology that that's the case. But beyond this, there's also evidence from virtual reality altruistic dilemmas. So Indrajit Patil ran this study a couple of years ago. And this incorporates more plausible altruistic dilemmas in VR. So in this case, you are trying to flee a burning building and you come across an individual who is injured, and you can stop and help this individual, but it's at a risk to yourself. So you could lose your own life by helping this individual. And again, participants are either face this in virtual reality, or they're presented with a text-based vignette version of this. And the same judgment behavior discrepancy is found. So in the text-based vignette sort of condition, most participants say, yes, I would definitely stop. I would definitely sacrifice myself in order to save this individual. But actually in the virtual reality scenario itself, you see the opposite. So most people actually flee as quickly as they can. So we see that evidence now beyond these sacrificial dilemmas. And I think probably more significantly, taking this a step further, Dries Boston a few years ago ran sort of a lab-based construction of a trolley-type problem. So here in the bottom picture, you can see that the left box has 1 mouse in it, the right box has 5 mice in it. And as a participant, you're told that those 5 mice are going to be administered this lethal electric shock unless you divert it to the 1 mouse. And obviously, unbeknownst to the participants, that's not a real shock, but they don't know that. And again, this is presented in 2 formats. So it's presented as a text-based vignette and participants make judgments, or they come into the lab and they do this behavioral experiment. And again, there's the same evidence there of this judgment behavior discrepancy. So on paper, everybody says, you know, I definitely wouldn't do it. And in the lab, the opposite was found. So we do have evidence across different paradigms now that we do see judgment behavior discrepancy here. Okay, so next steps then. So I've already talked a little bit about a set of studies looking at mode of presentation. So those are still ongoing. But there's also this question about behavior and VR and its place in this area of research. And this is a much bigger challenge. So it's difficult to talk about concepts like ecological validity when you're using trolley type cases, whether you're presenting them in text-based format or virtual reality. So one of the next steps really is to consider whether virtual reality is a sound, reliable, valid measure of moral behavior. And if so, does it extend beyond this very sort of niche paradigm? And that's something that we are doing at the moment. And there's a few different ways of approaching this, and I'm happy to talk about this more afterwards as well. So one of the things that we've been doing is looking for more plausible cases and more realistic instances that can be constructed in virtual reality. And also cases beyond these sacrificial moral dilemmas. So we can think about greater good dilemmas. So we're capturing this sort of other dimension of utilitarian responding. But also we can think about the emergence of future technologies and building dilemmas around those too, so that we might be able to have slightly more sort of manipulated cases, but they might be more believable. So that's something we're working on at the moment, and I'd be really open to talking to anyone about that approach. One of the other things that I'm doing in a lot more detail at the moment is also manipulating different moral principles in virtual reality. So it gives you a really nice tool and a nice way of doing this. And you probably won't be able to see these videos because they are so small, but I'll explain both of these. So in the left-hand video, this is a recording from a footbridge dilemma in VR. And you can see there's just a single person on the track instead of 5. So that's a manipulation we're running at the moment. And these are really useful ways of also looking at whether, people are just pushing for the sake of it in virtual reality. On the right hand video, and I'm not sure if you can see, but there's actually a bunny rabbit on the track. So we can start to make quite strong manipulations of the types of avatars or the types of individuals that we're putting into these scenes. And there's plenty of other moral principles that we can start to manipulate using virtual reality. So inevitability can be manipulated, whether the potential individual is injured or not. So there's a number of different things we can do there. Okay, so I want to sort of finish on 2 points and give plenty of time for questions. And one of those points really comes back to this question about ecological validity and the use of these virtual trolley problems. So as I said, I think it's really difficult to talk about ecological validity when it comes to sacrificial moral dilemmas anyway. And then when you start looking at virtual reality as a measure of behavior using those paradigms, it becomes even more complicated. But one of the really useful and valuable things about using virtual reality as a testing tool, I think, is that it gives you access to or ways of studying experiences and sensations that have previously been ignored completely in moral and social psychology because we've not had ways of looking at them before. So using VR technologies, we can look at experiences and sensations like immediacy, presence, pressure, and touch, and how all of those things affect decision making. And that's not something we've been able to do previously. And these are the kinds of concepts and sensations that are at the foundation of a lot of social and moral theories. So I think this is really valuable. And there's value in creating an experience, even if it doesn't look very realistic. If you can generate what I call sensory similarity, then it can give you insights into a number of really interesting phenomena. But again, it will be interesting to hear what you have to say about that. And then I'll finish with just some questions about ethical considerations. So right at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that I had originally started using these virtual trolley problems as a way of kind of simulating these moral dilemmas in a way that would, both look and feel realistic while protecting the welfare of participants. But since then, there's been a number of really valuable research done by philosophers, particularly Eric Ramirez, on whether we can say that producing these kinds of experiences and sensations in VR is ethical. So even if we're not causing physical harm, we can cause psychological harm by producing experimental protocol in virtual reality that's identical to real life. It can generate the same experiences and feelings, which could then cause psychological harm. So individuals in these kind of scenarios can suddenly become aware of what they're capable of doing, and that can actually have a big impact on an individual's welfare. And these are the kinds of things that I don't think are being considered enough at the moment in virtual reality paradigms. And the other thing that I want to say is I always get questions when I present this research about whether, there's an influence of gaming. Why do they look game-like? Could you improve the fidelity of these experiences, of these dilemmas? And the answer to that is definitely yes. So the software and the hardware is there, and it's coming out, it's rolling out every year. So we could produce really high fidelity virtual reality moral dilemmas. but we have to remember why we use them in the first place. So if we start to break down the barrier between that virtual and that real experience, then we really defeat the purpose of using that technology in the first place. And again, this is something that I don't think is necessarily being considered enough at the moment, but is something that I wanted to raise at the end. So I'm just going to say thank you to all of the amazing collaborators, my advisors, supervisors in the past who gave me the time to work on this, and all of the people that have made this research possible. And yeah, it's great working with everyone involved in these projects. So I'm going to end there and give plenty of time for questions. Thanks.
I'll clap since our webinar format does not allow individuals to show their videos. Thank you so much for a wonderful and very, very interesting talk. And we have 4 questions in Q&A. I can read them, or you can read them too. And if other people have questions, please do add them to Q&A. It might be harder to see them in the messages, though I do see that there's a question in the messages as well. So the first question is from Joanna. Awesome work. I have a couple of small questions. Have you looked at asking retrospective moral judgments about the VR mediated actions, such as it was morally wrong to push? I'm curious about whether it would look more like the VR action results or the traditional results, and whether that would shed light on explaining what's driving these findings. And then the second question is if you've looked at participants' experience with first-person video games as a possible influence. Experience with gaming could possibly decouple VR actions from moral evaluation.
Great, thank you, and thanks for such a great question, Joanna. Yeah, so I'll tackle your first question first. So we haven't asked specifically, was it morally wrong to push? But I have studied post decisions and things like regret following actions. So what you typically find is that in general public and student populations, if they are if they give the characteristically utilitarian responses in the VR setups, they express regret afterwards. So they say, I regret what I've done. If I did it again, I wouldn't do that. What you find in specialist populations, so if you look at helping professions and training professionals, you don't see that same regret. So you see resilience instead. So if they are endorsing a utilitarian response in the VR setups, they stick with that decision and they say, if I was faced with this again, I'd do the same thing again. But yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, another thing I should say there is that a lot of the studies that we've done have been within subjects, repeated measures designs. So the same individuals do both the VR and the tech. So we also looked at comparing that to between subjects, and you see no differences and no order effects there as well. And yeah, your second question about gaming experience, a really important question. And these are things that are always really difficult to control for. But in all of these studies, we control for previous and current gaming experience, and also break that down into different types of games. And so far, we found no relationship between that experience or self-reported experience and what happens in virtual reality. Hopefully that answers your question.
All right. Next up is Killian's. So he says, really interesting stuff. I was really intrigued by the studies changing mode of presentation, really put a lot of the possible questions I was thinking off to bed. Really nice work. I wonder if there's a role of certainty. If it's written down in a text-based vignette, there's no ambiguity. Participants are told basically if P then Q with no wiggle room. But the VR environment might feel more flexible, that there is a chance that the stated negative outcome might not happen.
Yeah, hi Killian. Thanks, really, really good question. And you know what, I'd love to talk to you more about this actually, because I I've almost been thinking the opposite recently. So I've been doing some work on, and this is sort of more in philosophy, about how individuals kind of fill the blanks in text-based vignettes and scenarios. So what information are individuals adding that we haven't told them is there? Myself and Nat Hansen ran a study recently where we gave people trolley-type cases in an online chat room. And a lot of people, when they justified their utilitarian responses, said things like, I imagined that the person I was pushing was a really bad person. So they were kind of adding this extra information. And I've always seen virtual reality as a way of controlling for that. So I'm essentially controlling for everyone's imagination, because I give them exactly what they want to see. But the point that you've made there is actually a really good one. And I think that would be that would fall under design considerations for the scenarios themselves. And I think you're right. So in some cases, you do see individuals trying to do things in virtual reality that they obviously know they can't do in a text-based vignette. So it swings around about the balance between the two. But I think that's something that I need to think about, and maybe you have ideas about how I could incorporate that into virtual reality. But great question, thank you.
Next up, we have Fen. She says, I like your theoretical explanations. Related to Joanna's second point, I wonder if people might feel compelled to do something in virtual reality. They're given the option to act, and not doing anything might seem like they failed to use the option.
Yeah, really, really nice question, Van. And I completely agree with you. So there's a couple of ways that we're trying to tackle that at the moment. So in previous research, I looked at things like, coercion. So do you feel coerced to act in a particular case? And we've done a few manipulations, and that it didn't seem to be that people felt coerced to act. But tackling the kind of acting for the sake of it side of things, that's what we're doing right now. So we have these sets of virtual moral dilemmas where you move from, like one person versus one, where you wouldn't necessarily expect people to actually do anything, one person versus one animal, and then eventually one person versus an inanimate object, as a way of sort of tackling that issue. Hopefully that answers your question.
Right, next up, we have Lucia. What about the consistency of people choosing the utilitarian answer in both the personal and impersonal versions of the dilemmas? Did you try VR simulations with the impersonal version and administer both versions to the same people? And then a follow-up question of, did professional people choose VR significantly less in the utilitarian answer?
Okay, cool. So yeah, really nice question again. So at the moment, we've not compared personal and impersonal cases, but I know that Melissa McDonald has done that over in the US, or she did that a few years ago. So we've been predominantly focusing on these personal, up close moral dilemmas, but I think that's a really interesting choice based on the previous research that's been done using impersonal moral dilemmas in VR. They tend to find a ceiling effect. So they do find more characteristically utilitarian responses in the VR cases. But because they're high anyway, there's that ceiling effect, which is really what motivated us to look at these high conflict dilemmas instead. But that's a great question. And I'm just going back to your other question now. So did professional people choose in VR significantly less? No, so that didn't happen. So we found the same pattern of responses across the helping professionals, and we controlled for age and sort of experience in that profession. We found the same pattern of responses in those individuals than as we did in sort of the general public and student populations. So no differences there.
Next up, we have Chris Street. I wonder what responses you may get if the moral decision-making is masked, such as the task is to cross the bridge and the moral decision just happens to arise, rather than setting up an explicit push-no push decision to assess their actions, when the impetus for action is self-generated, rather than the intention for action being explicitly requested by the experimenter. Logistically tricky though, does the source of intention to act matter? Inception style.
Hi, Chris. Great question. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think one of the one of the reasons why the cases have been built the way that they have been built is so that you have to make this very explicit option between two choices. And one is this characteristically utilitarian choice and one isn't. So that's kind of the typical paradigm or the typical use of it in this field. I think in virtual reality, though, it would be really interesting to generate a narrative where it's perhaps not so explicit. And there's a really awesome group of experimental philosophers in the US creating sort of virtual reality cases at the moment where they build it into a much bigger narrative like that. And I think they're rolling that out at the minute. So it'd be interesting to see what the outcome of that is. But I don't think anyone has really looked at what you've specifically said in virtual reality. So I think that would be really interesting to do.
Masi has says, very nice and clear talk. I wondered if there's a qualitative research simply asking under what conditions participants would do X and under what condition they would do Z and Y. Also, have you thought of doing studies based on real life data where following a real incident, people have reason as to why they did or didn't act in a utilitarian manner? I'd be interested in working on both.
Great, thanks, Matty. Again, really, really good question. So I think there is limited qualitative research looking at that. So one of the things that we've done in our studies is to ask people, but this is generally post decision. So we've asked people, why did you do what you did? What was the reasoning behind it? Did you think you would be successful? Those kinds of questions. But again, they're after the decision. I think some really well done qualitative research in this area would actually be really interesting. The real life data question is something that I've been trying to tackle for a long time. Again, it becomes really messy when you look in the real world, because these kind of sacrificial trolley type cases rarely occur. And cases where there is utilitarian decision making, there tends to be a number of other things happening at the same time. But it's something that I would be really interested in doing, and something that I think is important for this area of research.
Next, Andrea. Hello, I was very captivated by the research you presented, both as a social psychologist studying moralization of economic inequality, support for redistribution, and a sadly naive fan of virtual reality. During the last part of your presentation, among the next steps, you also included a part about moral principles. I'm currently studying moral convention, such as Skitka et al., effects on people's support for redistribution. And given its closeness to how people believe it's fundamentally right or wrong, I would say it might have a role in predicting people's decision in a trolley-type problem. Thank you so much for a great presentation.
Oh, thank you. I completely agree. I think that's a really interesting area to look at. And that's why I raised the point about starting to think about those moral principles in more detail at the end, because I think I 100% agree with you on the point you've made there. And you can also see, many other areas of research and many other principles that, could easily be manipulated in these virtual reality environments, but could also, as you say, explain, what's going on in those virtual environments. So yeah, really great point.
Next is Raluca. I'm very sorry if I'm butchering people's names. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering how your findings in VR dilemmas, more utilitarian in the action condition, fit with the aversion to harmful actions account, such as Cushman, Crockett, etc. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really nice question, a challenging one, but a really good one. So I think Indra Patil originally started thinking about how those accounts might change based on sort of the contextual richness of a virtual reality environment. So, those models are talking about the values you ascribe to actions and outcomes. And in virtual reality, that process could be totally different because you're not relying on imagination. And for me, like from a personal perspective, that's a really big deal because I actually have really sort of low vividness of mental imagery. So I struggle to visualize things. So putting something in virtual reality really changes what values I'm assigning to individuals in that situation, but also the outcome that I'm endorsing and the action that I'm endorsing. So that the theory is that what's happening in VR is that you might be assigning more negative value to the outcome of seeing 5 individuals die, and that might outweigh any negativity you had initially for pushing that one individual. So it's a way of adapting those existing models to account for what's happening in VR. Those are really difficult things to actually study and look at. So one thing we thought about doing was using eye tracking. So we could look at, who are people focusing on in virtual reality? Is that different to who they're focusing on in these text-based vignettes? But then there's been a load of research showing that it's really hard to tell that from eye tracking because some people look at the person they want to save, some people look away from the person that they want to save, and the same for individuals being sacrificed. But I would really like to look at that in more detail and say something more conclusive about it. But hopefully that answers your question.
That's all the questions in Q&A. I did have one small question because you brought up potential psychological harmful effects of using VR methods. And I was wondering if you have any plans to collect physiological data to see what are these participants experiencing. They're probably not experiencing much when they're reading off a text, but if they're in a VR setting that is kind of believable, especially with the haptic responses, then they might be more aroused upon pushing people.
Yeah, really, really nice question. So we've collected skin conductance response rates and heart rates previously. And using, I should say that in all of the experiments, we have these kind of control conditions as well. So they complete kind of a control task in that format too. So we can get a measure across all of the different scenarios for the physiological arousal. And what you generally find is that heart rate really rapidly increases in the virtual reality moral cases, and very quickly. So it usually increases very significantly when individuals are suddenly aware of what's happening in the situation. And at the time, we weren't using technology that allowed us to pinpoint that and lock it at the moment of decision making. So, we couldn't say anything informative, with regards to Green's model. But I think we've got better technologies in place now to study that in more detail. But yeah, so we've started to look, but there's definitely more we can do in that area.
That is fascinating. Oh, and our last question comes from Jesse. I'm curious to hear more about the logistics of developing the VR setup. What kinds of collaborators, such as engineers, did you partner with?
That's a really nice question, Jesse, and one that I would love to end on. So I'm a huge fan of interdisciplinary research, and I know it can be really, really challenging at times. But without it, these kind of experiments just wouldn't have been possible at all. So I was lucky to do my PhD as part of a Marie Curie funded program. So there was 25 of us, and there was only 5 or 6 psychologists, and everyone else was from other disciplines, and we worked together. So we were able to incorporate one another's methodologies and learn about that in a really positive space. And my supervisors were from different disciplines too, so I was able to learn about different technologies and equipment. So with virtual reality development, and I'm happy to talk more about this, so if anyone wants to drop me an email, I'll talk about this forever. But it's more and more increasingly it's possible to build these scenarios yourselves because there's open source software. Most of it doesn't require a huge amount of sort of programming expertise. So, these things are accessible and available to everyone. But again, I think interdisciplinary collaboration always helps because you have that methodological expertise then coming from somewhere else. But yeah, hopefully that helps.
All right, with that, I will thank you once again for your really exciting talk, and we have a lot of really good questions. This was recorded, so we'll be uploading this to the YouTube channel. I'll stop recording.